Hi, my name is Tate Troxel, and I'm going to be speaking on automation, trust, reliance, and compliance for my special topic presentation. So we're going to start off with what exactly is automation. Automation is defined as the technique of making an apparatus, a process, or a system operate automatically. And so there isn't one way to define automation. It kind of looks different depending on how much automation is going on within the system. So as we can see in Sheridan and Verplancks levels of automation, it ranges from a level 1, which is where the computer offers no assistance at all and the human pretty much does everything on their own, to somewhere in the middle where usually the human is doing the operations, and then the automation can execute a specific suggestion if the human allows it to. And then you can get all the way up to level 10 where the computer decides everything and pretty much just ignores what the human says, and the automation is running the whole system, and the human really has no say in what's going on unless they might have like an automatic shut-off switch. So as we get into just some examples of automation that everyone probably is pretty familiar with, so you've got airplanes, is a pretty big one. It's pretty much as soon as an airplane takes off, after about 300 feet, they turn on their cruise control, set their destination, and the automation in the plane takes over. It accounts for different wind, different altitude settings, wind to decline, and basically the automation can take the plane all the way into the runway until about 300 yards out, whenever the pilot can take the controls and land the aircraft successfully. Some aircrafts, or most aircrafts, can all land themselves now. There's still not as much trust with that. The pilots believe they can do it better at this point. But there still is the capability in the aircraft if it needed to do so. As for cars, you can look at an old Honda Accord. This picture here is from, I think, 2003, which it has automatic lights, cruise control, which is just basically like a level 2 on the automation scale. Very minimal, but it does allow the user a little less workload where they don't have to be constantly pumping the gas as they're driving on the highway. They can set that cruise control, and the automation will keep the car running at that speed. And then on the right here, we've got a Tesla, which has the capability of driving basically all by itself. Not completely street legal yet, but it does have the lane assistance, and it does have the capability of driving itself. And automation within banks and credit cards, that's one not many people think about. But whenever you swipe your credit card, you don't have to do anything like paying for that item. It's all electronically processed. That's automation. Sometimes we take that for granted. If you swipe the card and the automation wasn't working correctly, then your purchase might not go through. Whenever you're within your bank website or app, you can set specific, if you're a stock investor, you can set stock to automatically trade at a certain price. Whether it drops below a price, it can buy automatically. You can set it to when it reaches above a certain price, it'll sell it. That way the user or yourself doesn't have to be constantly monitoring what the market is doing, but instead you can set where like your safe range is of where you would like to sell, and you can set that specific range in there. And then lastly, we've got assembly lines, which is a very clear demonstration of automation. This is an assembly line of cars where there's probably, on the scale of automation, is probably around a 9, where the automation is doing pretty much everything that it's programmed to do, and the user can step in if for some reason a part broke on one of the machines that's being automated. They can stop the system, fix the part that might have broke. But if everything's running smoothly, the operator shouldn't have to do anything, and the automation should be doing most of it all by itself, with maybe a few errors that pop up, and they can check that with the controller. But for the most part, they're going to be doing most of the automation by itself. So getting into more of the trust, reliance, and compliance part of the automation. So trusting automation, there's different amounts of trust that someone places within automation, and that kind of dictates how much automation they're going to allow for a system to do, is basically how much trust they have in that automation. So sometimes too much trust can get you into problems because the user isn't paying attention to what's going on, and the automation might fail because they aren't paying attention and they had too much trust in the system, which can lead to some accidents. Or sometimes there's too little trust where someone's trying to take on, as a user, too much workload and they're not relying on any of the automation that's there for them. And in return, they can miss things themselves, whether that was monitoring a like a tracking system, if you're monitoring like air traffic control, if you're trying to take on too much burden and not relying on that automation, that can get you into some trouble. And basically, when a system errors occur, which is the main two systems errors are misses or false alarms, that kind of drives the user towards compliance or reliance. So we'll start off with compliance. To define that, compliance is how the operator responds to an automation alert, and this stems from a false alarm, which is an incorrect indication of an event. So, for example, like an air traffic control identifying potential collisions that are not there. That would be an example of a false alarm. So there wasn't anything there, but the automation said there was there. And as you increase false alarms with automation, this is just going to overall reduce the operator compliance. So if there's a bunch of alerts going off about the false collisions, then the user, the air traffic controller, is just going to say, well, I'm not going to trust the system anymore. I'll just do it myself. So their compliance is actually going to go down. But if that system, whenever it does send out an alarm and it's not a false alarm, but it's actually true, then the user will have a higher compliance because they'll trust that system. And then on the flip side, you have reliance, which is how the operator responds to an automation non-alert. And so this stems from what is called a miss, which is a failure of the automation to notice an event. So if you were walking up to an automatic door, for example, and it didn't open, that is, you were relying on that door to open because you know in the past it's open for you because it's automatic. But if you walk up there and there's a miss and that door doesn't open, well, now with the increase in automation misses, it's just going to reduce the overall operator reliance. So the more reliable that system is, that automation is, the more reliance the user is going to have on it. When then, just like I said, if that reliance or if that automation starts failing, then that reliance is going to decrease, and the user is just going to say, I don't need the automation. So some issues, concerns, and considerations with respect to human factors for automation is the major issues are over-reliance and loss of skill. So if the user is over-relying on a system to do everything, then, like I said earlier, the system could fail. Systems aren't perfect. Automation isn't perfect. And if that were to fail and a user was, I don't know, sleeping on the job, relying on the automation, then something could go terribly wrong. And then with the same thing, if they're over relying on the system and they're not practicing the skill that the automation is doing, then they're ultimately not going to have that skill in the event that they need to use it. So if automation fails and they weren't over relying on it, so they saw what was wrong and they tried to go fix it and do whatever the automation was doing, they try and do it by themselves, then their skills, if they haven't been practicing it because all they've been doing is watching the automation do it, then they're not going to be able to effectively complete whatever that automation was doing. So if that automation, go back to the air traffic control system, was tracking all of these different planes and then it fails and the user has to jump in and do this job, but they haven't been monitoring the system like they should have been, and their skills are degraded now, well, they might miss some planes, some indicators that are coming in, which could lead to possible aircraft collision. That would be a major extreme example, but just to kind of put that into perspective of how the skill can degrade if the user is relying too much on the automation. But as of concerns for the actual user and why we would want to use automation is if a user is having too large of a workload. So for example, if someone was working in let's say like a Lowe's and they're loading a bunch of stuff onto shelves, well, maybe instead of them having to load these 50-pound boxes up 6 feet on this ladder, which is a lot, like a heavy workload. It can use automation, some sort of robot to come lift things up, place them on shelves. That would be more physical workload. It could also be mental workload, where let's just go right back to the air traffic control example. Someone who's staring at a screen trying to monitor all these flights in the air going by, which ones need to be at what altitudes. That can be a lot for someone's mind. It can get taxing, and ultimately they can get so tired that they can miss some of those aircrafts that might be on the same altitude paths. So the automation can help take that workload off. But the major consideration with all of automation is you got to find the right balance, the right control. So just like around the 4 to 7 range of automation is usually good. If you're on the extremes of 1 or 10, there's usually going to be some sort of either workload problem or over reliance problem. But if you can find that middle ground and where you're balancing the automation with the user, then it can actually be extremely effective, and it can help both the system and the process of what's supposed to being accomplished, and the user and the lifespan that they're going to have within their job, because they're going to be able to last longer if they're not working as hard on a daily basis. So some of these current human factor research studies that are going on right now, I took 2 of the main ones that are prevalent in today's society. So automated cars, there's a big push for that. With automated cars, the main concern is whether roads have been designed in a way that is consistent with the known driver capabilities and limitations that allow drivers to maintain situation awareness and the ability to take control when necessary. So basically, that's just saying that with along like road designs, people who are driving those cars, if they're relying like completely on automation, then if they're just leaning back, playing on their phone, the road conditions right now might not be consistent with what that automation is used to. Maybe the automation was conducted on like an 8-foot road, and now you're driving on a 6-foot road, and that could mess up with the sensors. So, or also, so basically, like right now, the automation that is in cars that they're trying to do on a fully automation level is not conducive to the driving conditions that we have on our roads today. According to Dr. Nancy Grugel, she's a human factors engineer and ergonometrics expert. She did research at the Army Research Laboratory and Lockheed Martin. She says that automation really right now, fully automated cars are just negatively affecting mental workload and situational awareness of drivers. In her recent studies, she found that that the drivers who use semi-automation in their cars are actually 1.5 seconds slower to stopping when there's an obstacle than someone who's just driving the car with no automation at all. And it's because they're relying completely on that automation to do the driving. Even though they're still trying to watch the road, they're relying on that automation. And so once they see an object, they freak out and they turn the automation off, and then they brake instead of just driving the car themselves, where they're fully alert. And then as soon as they see an obstacle, they're able to react. So until like users are able to 100% just trust the automation to stop the car and not feel the need to take over, there's really not going to be ever a need for fully automated cars, because as long as there's people out there that aren't fully trusting the capabilities of the automation, then there's going to be people that are hesitating, that are doing things that the fully automated other cars aren't doing, and there's not going to be that continuity between all of the cars on the road. So as Dr. Grugel said, without driving the car, the skills are going to degrade. So people, if they're never driving their car, in the event that they need to take over the controls, they're not going to have the proper skills to drive. They're going to have decreased vigilance. Therefore, they're probably not going to be looking at the road. They're not going to be looking out for indicators of potential hazards, because they're just going to be relying on the automation to do so. And that gets into a lot of messy situations, because automation is good to a point that it can't calculate unexpected occurrences. There's not, like, the computer system cannot just account for billions of different occurrences that could happen. So they can account for most, which will prevent probably a lot of collisions on the road, potential pedestrians crossing the roads. But there's always going to be those 1 in a million chances that happen that someone who is driving their car might have a better chance than the automation. So research is still going into the fully automated cars. That's a good theory that a lot of scientists would like to see in the future. I mean, we see Tesla, BMW, Mercedes, they're all trying to work towards that eventually. Another system that with human factors is automated surgery, and that's becoming a growing study. So just with doctors trying to take off the workload for them, there is a current, as you can see here, it's called the Da Vinci surgical system. It's actually really low on the automation scale. As you can see, the doctor can use controls to operate the 4 different limbs to operate on the patient. These limbs allow the doctor to be much more steady with their hands. They might not be able to with their bare hands. They can make much smaller incisions with the smaller needles and knives than the ones that they use on a regular table. Which, by making smaller incisions, leads to faster recoveries, less chance of infections due to the faster recoveries. But with where the human factors comes in with this is the forearm Da Vinci system has to take in the ergonometrics of the patient who's laying on the table. So the arms must be able to reach a 7-foot long person. It needs to be able to reach a 5-foot long person, someone who may be 2 feet wide, someone who may be only a foot wide. So they just need to think about, and then the bed itself that they're operating on needs to take into account just human limitations and dimensions. As for fully automated systems, that gets again into a con is the loss of skill of the doctors. If the system is fully automated and it's performing the surgeries without the doctor and the doctor's just monitoring, then in the event that automation was to fail and the doctor needed to come in, maybe they hadn't done a surgery in 6 months because it's just been automation doing it, they might not be equipped as they were for the automation to perform the surgery, which could lead to, I don't know, all the way up to possible death if the surgery was extensive, and that just leads to lawsuits. So as of right now, there is no, we're not really close to getting to that fully automated surgical equipment, but they are working to get a little more automation to take off the workload from the doctor. But the balance there is not decreasing the overall performance and keeping up with the standards that the doctors need to maintain in order to be surgeon qualified, and that way they're not losing their skills and they're not their abilities that they were trained to do. See, lastly, we just got 2 major automation fails. On the left, there's a video. You can click the tab if you want. It's just a video of a Tesla that's fully automated driving down the road. It couldn't account for this person in the dark crossing the road, which led to a collision, and the person was severely injured. On the right, we've got a Boeing 737 MAX. Might have heard of it in the news, but there's a pitot tube malfunction where it made the plane's automation think that the plane was in a climb and that it was stalling. So it was forcing the nose of the aircraft down, which actually led to 2 aircraft crashing into the ground, and the pilots were not able to override. So those are just 2 automation fails. Although automation helps in many areas, there's always that 1 in a billion chance that it can't account for. And if the user isn't able to overcome and have the proper skills to take over the task, we can lead to catastrophic events such as death in these 2 cases. That's all I have, and these are the sources that if you would like to do any further research concerning automation, trust, reliance, or compliance.